It's August 23rd, 2021. I'm Todd Dunn, and today I'm back aboard my 1936 wooden powerboat Tortuga, and I'd like to continue talking a little bit about lithium batteries on boats, since yesterday when I was making the beginning of this video, I ran out of battery. So let's talk a little bit about lithium batteries. Yesterday I mostly talked about some of the limitations in terms of, or at least considerations in terms of charging and discharging batteries. Today I'd like to talk about some of the pluses. Now, some of this is sort of generic information, and some of it is personal experience, because I now have a lithium iron phosphate battery on Tortuga as my house bank, and it is charging from solar. And I just used the Victron Connect app on my phone to query my charge controller, and the battery is currently sitting at 13.76 volts, and the charger is in float stage. But more interesting, it's taking 0 watts from the solar panels to maintain the battery in float stage. And the total power that has gone into the battery today, it's currently about 130, is 10 watt hours, which is less than 1 amp hour. And that's all it's taking to maintain the battery at float. And I noticed the same thing yesterday when I was aboard. When I got here, the battery was also in float. It had been completely charged by my solar panel, and it was drawing, again, 0 watts from solar to keep it at float, which is an interesting result, and that basically my 100 watts of solar on the cabin top is doing essentially nothing right now, even though there is some solar energy reaching them. Now, if I was to turn some things on and start to draw on the battery, I would get some solar in, and today it's overcast and foggy. I could probably still get about 25 to 30 watts out of the solar panels, but the battery doesn't need that to stay afloat. So even on a really miserable day with almost no solar, I'll get enough energy from my 100 watt solar panel to maintain my battery at float. So that's a useful thing to know, that once you get these batteries fully charged, they have so little self-discharge that they're just going to sit there and not require really anything to maintain them at float voltage. Now, the other thing that I noted is that overnight the batteries fell to a voltage of 13.36 volts, and that's the minimum it hit last night, when it was getting 0 watts all night from the solar, and presumably my bilge pumps probably ran at least once. So the battery is sitting about half a volt higher, maybe a little more, maybe 0.6 of a volt higher than my lead acid batteries were, which would normally sit about 12.75 volts as their minimum overnight when they weren't being charged. So these lithium batteries maintain higher voltage, and that can be significant for some electronics. Another aspect of that is that the lithium batteries stay at a higher voltage pretty much through most of their discharge cycle, and they're probably going to stay above 13 volts until they're more than 90% discharged. So electronics are going to work just fine even when the batteries are 80-85% discharged, because the electronics will still be seeing 13 volts to operate on, and that makes marine electronics happy. Another factor with lithium iron phosphate batteries is that let's take a 100 amp hour rated lithium iron phosphate battery, which is about the same size as a group 27 flooded lead acid battery or AGM battery, which would also have a rating of about 100 amp hours. Well, the lead acid or AGM battery can routinely be drawn down by around 50% of its capacity before continued drawdown will start to have a permanent effect on the battery's capacity. And if you draw a lead acid battery down by 80% of its capacity, so there's only 20% left, the battery will be permanently affected and the overall capacity of the battery will decline. That will not happen with a lithium iron phosphate battery. You can draw it down by 80% of its capacity and still get 4,000 cycles out of the battery without significant capacity loss, which is a very important thing to know. It means that the battery is going to last a very long time. Now, on a boat here in Maine, where, in the best case, we might get 150 days in a season. If we cycled it every day, which, of course, if you don't use the boat every day, is not going to happen. But if you did cycle it every day, and we were to get 4,500 cycles, that would mean if the 150 days in a year, we'd be looking at 30 years lifetime for the battery based solely on cycle life. Of course, it's quite likely that the electronics in the battery management system would die well before that 30-year point. But certainly you can expect a long life out of one of these batteries, probably in many cases longer than you're likely to own a boat. So that means that when you put a lithium iron phosphate battery into the boat, it's likely to be the last battery you'll ever buy for your boat. Now, one thing though that comes up as a consequence of the long life is this. When you're installing a battery bank with the batteries in parallel, you really should install all of the batteries at the same time. So let's say we want to put in a 400 amp hour battery bank. That means we're going to have to buy 400 amp hours worth of lithium iron phosphate batteries at one time, which even with the inexpensive batteries is going to cost you at least $1,600 and could be considerably more than that if you buy more expensive brands of batteries. So that is a consideration, but you have to balance that against the fact that you will probably never have to replace those batteries again. And even if you do, there's a good chance that they'll be covered by warranty and you'll get a replacement from the manufacturer. Of course, that presupposes that the manufacturer will still be in business 10 or 12 years from now, but which you can never know when you buy something. But the experience with lithium iron phosphate batteries is they last a long time, probably longer than you're going to own the boat. So those are some of the real pluses of this type of battery. And as I mentioned before, because they weigh substantially less than lead acid batteries, they're much easier to move around, put on the boat in out of the way places, and take off the boat if you need to. You can also store them for quite a substantial time without any significant self-discharge. Now, that means if you're in a place like Maine where we don't use our boats in the winter, you can leave the batteries even at a partial state of charge over the winter. They won't discharge very much over the winter, maybe 10% of capacity, and that won't hurt them. Of course, you do have to consider that these batteries are expensive. You might not want to leave them on the boat over the course of the winter. So that means that it might be desirable to take them home and store them at home. But because of two things, they're completely sealed and don't vent any gases. So you can take them home and put them anywhere in your house without any concern. They'll be completely safe. And of course, they're much easier, as I said, to get out of the boat because they're so much lighter. Now, another plus of lithium iron phosphate batteries is their behavior when they're being drawn down by substantial loads. Now, when you have a lead acid battery and say you've got it connected to an inverter and you put 100 amp load on it, a 100 amp hour lead acid battery cannot sustain 100 amp load for an hour, because at higher current draws, the capacity of a lead acid battery decreases. And this is described by something called the Poickert factor. And what it comes down to is that at high current draws, even the best lead acid batteries, best AGM batteries, are only going to be able to provide about 75 to 80% of their rated current. Now, this is not true for lithium iron phosphate batteries. They are much less affected by the magnitude of a current draw, and the impact may only be 1 to 2% of capacity. So if I have a 100 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery and I put 100 amp load on it, it'll last most of an hour and I will be able to get almost 100 amp hours of power out of the battery. And that means that I don't need as big a capacity battery bank as I would with lead acid batteries to accomplish the same current loading and operating times for high current components. Of course, this has to be balanced against the fact that lithium iron phosphate batteries are generally limited by their battery management systems to around 100 amp draw for a 100 amp hour battery and maybe a 200 amp draw for a larger capacity battery, although that depends on the specific battery management system. So, but you can count on getting much closer to the rated capacity of the battery out of the battery with a lithium iron phosphate battery than you can with any kind of lead acid battery during high current draws. And you couple that with the fact that 100 amp hour lead acid battery, flooded battery, really shouldn't be drawn down by more than 50 amp hours. And if it's an AGM battery, you can probably get away with drawing it down by 70 amp hours. But with a lithium battery, if you have to, you can draw it down by 100 amp hours, which just means that you need fewer lithium iron phosphate batteries to accomplish the same amount of work from your batteries than you do with lead acid batteries. Okay, I didn't want to talk too long today, but that pretty much covers what I wanted to say about some of the pluses of these batteries. And as I mentioned last time, the biggest negative of these batteries right now is their cost. They've come down a lot in cost, but they're still expensive. And however, if I was right now to say I need a battery bank that I can draw down by 90 amp hours, if I was going to install a lithium iron phosphate battery, I could use one 100 amp hour rated battery, and I could consistently, for a long period of time, many years, draw that battery down by 90 amp hours. In order to accomplish that and get good battery life with flooded batteries, let's say AGM batteries, I would need two 100 amp hour capacity AGM batteries, and they would actually cost more now than a single lithium iron phosphate battery. So right now, because of the drop in price of lithium iron phosphate batteries, setting up a battery bank with a particular capacity is probably cheaper with lithium iron phosphate than it is with quality AGM batteries. Of course, you could still go with relatively inexpensive flooded lead acid batteries and achieve the same amount of power available from the battery bank for, say, $320 that you could achieve from a $460 lithium iron phosphate battery, and you would not need to have any kind of charging isolation on the lead acid batteries. And so, lead acid batteries are still cheaper. If you buy flooded batteries, price is probably pretty much a wash if you compare lithium iron phosphate to AGM batteries, simply because of the fact that you have to have a lithium iron phosphate specific charging system for the lithium iron phosphate batteries, and it needs to isolate battery charging from your alternator output. Okay, that's about all I have to say today. If people have questions, please put them in the comments and I will be glad to answer them. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, why don't you do it now, so you will get a notification when I post more content like this or on any of the other topics I'm interested in. And if you do subscribe, don't forget to click that notification bell. And no matter what you do, give me a like. Thanks a lot. Hope you enjoyed watching this video.